The static hiss from the speakers in the Tactical Operations Center was the sound of dying hope. On the central screen, a Predator drone's grainy, infrared feed showed 3 small, hot shapes huddled behind a rock formation. Hunter 3, pinned. Below them, in the jagged chasm known as the Serpent's Maw, at least 24 more heat signatures swarmed their position. The canyon walls, sheer and unforgiving, made a conventional air assault impossible. Worse, somewhere on the plateau above, an SA-15 gauntlet system was active, its search radar sweeping a deadly, invisible net over the entire area of operations. Any aircraft flying above the canyon rim would be painted, locked, and destroyed in under 30 seconds. Colonel Marcus Thorne, his face a mask of chiseled granite and sleep deprivation, paced before the screens. "Status on the Apaches." "Still no-go, sir," a young lieutenant replied, not looking up from his console. "The Gauntlet's radar is blanketing the approach. They'd be scrap metal before they got within 5 clicks. And the F-16s. Same problem, Colonel. They can't get a targeting solution without exposing themselves. The canyon is too deep, the walls too narrow. They'd have to fly directly over the target area, right into the kill box." Thorne slammed a fist on the metal console, the sound a dull thud in the tense quiet. "So we just watch them get carved up? Unacceptable." He ran a hand over his crew cut, the frustration radiating from him like heat. They had 47 minutes until dusk, when Hunter 3's thermal advantage would vanish and they would be overrun. In the back of the room, leaning against a server rack, Captain Eva Rostova watched the scene unfold. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her official capacity on this rotation was Flight Data Analyst, a ground-bound purgatory for pilots under administrative review. She wore a simple flight suit, stripped of squadron patches, its olive-drab fabric worn soft with use. Her hands were still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. She tracked the sweep of the enemy radar on a side monitor, calculated the angles of the canyon walls from the topographical display, and listened to the desperate, clipped radio transmissions from the men on the ground. A plan, clean and terrifyingly simple, formed in her mind. It was a ghost of a maneuver, something her father, a test pilot who had chased the ragged edge of the envelope until it finally tore, had once sketched on a napkin. A flight profile that defied doctrine, regulations, and common sense. She pushed herself off the wall, her boots making no sound on the concrete floor, and moved toward the command console. The lieutenants and sergeants parted for her, a silent acknowledgement of the pilot she used to be. She stopped a respectful distance from Colonel Thorne. "Sir," she said, her voice low but clear, cutting through the ambient stress. "There's a way." Thorne turned, his gaze dismissive. He saw a grounded pilot, a name on a problem file. "Captain Rostova. I don't recall asking for your input." "The canyon, sir," she continued, ignoring the slight. "The Gauntlet's radar can't see inside it. It's a blind spot. If you fly low enough, you can use the rock itself as a shield." A senior NCO chuckled softly. "Fly inside the Serpent's Maw? It's barely wide enough for a pickup truck in some places. Ma'am, an A-10 can fit," Eva stated, her tone flat, devoid of argument. It was a fact, not a suggestion. "You can approach from the west, below the ridgeline, and enter the canyon mouth. Follow the floor. There's a straight shot to their position. Provide close air support, cover their extraction, and exit east before the enemy can reposition their assets on the rim." Thorne stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He knew her file. He knew the whispers about the incident that had grounded her. A classified mission where she'd allegedly broken formation and violated a dozen rules to save a compromised SEAL team. A success that the brass had buried under a mountain of disciplinary action for its sheer recklessness. They called her a maverick, a cowboy. They called her a ghost. Her old call sign, Wraith, was spoken like a cautionary tale. "What you're describing, Captain," Thorne said, his voice dangerously soft, "is not a flight plan. It's suicide. The wind shear alone in that canyon could rip the wings off a warthog. You'd be flying blind, with meters of clearance on either side, against an entrenched enemy who knows you're coming. I will not authorize that kind of grandstanding. We don't throw away pilots and million-dollar assets on ghost stories. Now step back. Eva's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain the years she'd spent flying low-level routes in machines her father had helped design, learning the feel of the air as it compressed in tight spaces, the way an airframe shuddered just before it surrendered to physics. She had mapped every inch of that canyon on the simulator, practiced the entry until her hands knew the movements better than her own name. But none of that mattered here. In this room, she was just a problem to be managed. She gave a curt, formal nod. Yes, sir. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the TOC, leaving behind a silence thick with the colonel's rigid authority and the ticking clock that measured the lives of 3 men. The door hissed shut behind her, and the desert wind, already picking up grit as a sandstorm brewed on the horizon, greeted her like an old, unwelcome friend. Her path was clear, not to her bunk, but to the flight line, where a specific, ugly, brutally effective aircraft sat waiting under the bruised twilight sky. An aircraft that knew the difference between suicide and a calculated risk. She found Staff Sergeant Leo Vance under the wing of Hog 7-1, his flashlight beam tracing the hydraulic lines of the main landing gear. He was a man built of wiry muscle and quiet competence, the only crew chief who didn't treat her like a pariah. He'd been with her for 3 years, had seen her fly in ways that made other pilots pale. He looked up as she approached, his expression questioning but not surprised. "Trouble, Captain?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Hunter 3 is trapped in the Serpent's Maw," she said simply. "Colonel's out of options." Vance grunted, straightening up. He wiped a greasy hand on a rag. "And he's not listening to the one person who can get them out." It wasn't a question. He knew the politics of the command structure. He also knew his pilot. He looked past her, toward the darkening horizon where the first tendrils of the sandstorm were beginning to swallow the stars. "The storm's coming in fast. That's not going to make it any easier." "It's the only way," Eva replied, her gaze fixed on the nose of her A-10. The shark's teeth painted there were faded, chipped by shrapnel and sand. Faintly visible, almost like watermarks beneath the gray paint, were a series of small, stenciled silhouettes. Tanks, artillery pieces, radar dishes. Kills from a war no one here was authorized to discuss. "The storm will give me cover for the ingress and egress. It'll degrade their optics on the rim." Vance nodded slowly, the gears turning in his head. He knew what she was about to ask. He also knew the consequences. Helping her would be his career. Refusing would be his conscience. The choice was not difficult. "What do you need?" "The surgical loadout, Leo," she said, her voice dropping into the familiar cadence of pre-flight preparation. "Mark 82s on the outer pylons, cluster munitions on the inner. Full drum for the GU-8. And double-check the countermeasure pods. I want flares and chaff so thick they can't see the sky." "You got it," he turned to go, then paused. "Captain, Thorne didn't authorize this. Did he?" Eva met his gaze. "He will," she said. It was a statement of pure, unadulterated certainty. He would have no other choice. She swung herself up the integrated ladder and settled into the cockpit. The seat, molded to her form, felt like home. The air smelled of hydraulic fluid, worn leather, and ozone. It was the only place she felt whole. Her fingers brushed against the instrument panel, finding a small, worn piece of tape just to the right of the main display. Tucked beneath it was a tiny, folded photograph of a man with her same stormy eyes, standing proudly in front of an experimental X-plane. Her father, the man who taught her that every aircraft had a soul, a limit you could feel through the stick, and that rules were written for the flights that stayed on the map. She began her pre-flight checks, her movements economical and precise. Power on. Avionics humming to life. The heads-up display flickered, casting a faint green glow on her face. She strapped herself in, the harness a familiar embrace. She was not a ghost. She was a pilot, and she was going to work. As she finished her checklist, her personal comm unit crackled. It was Thorn. His voice was strained, stripped of its earlier arrogance. Rostova? You still think you can do this? The drone feed had clearly worsened. The desperation was absolute. Yes, sir, she answered, her voice betraying no emotion. There was a long pause, filled with the static of a man wrestling with his pride and his duty. The flight line is yours. Get them out. But know this, Captain. You scratch my paint. Your career is over. Understood, Colonel, she said, flipping the final switch. Hog 7-1 is wheels up in 5. The twin General Electric engines spooled up with a hungry whine that escalated into a deafening roar, a promise of the violence to come. Leo Vance gave her a sharp, affirmative nod from the ground, pulling the chocks. He stepped back and rendered a crisp salute, not to a captain, but to a legend he knew was about to be reborn. Eva returned the salute, a brief, sharp gesture, before her hands returned to the throttle and stick. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, began to taxi toward the runway, a gray, armored beast rolling into the teeth of an oncoming storm, ready to fly through hell to save 3 men its masters had already written off. The A-10 lumbered onto the runway, its heavy ordnance making it feel sluggish, tethered to the earth. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence. A wall of roiling brown dust advanced across the airfield, and the wind rocked the 30,000-pound aircraft on its tricycle gear. Air traffic control came through her headset, a nervous, young voice. Hog 7-1, you are cleared for takeoff. Wind is 290 at 30 knots, gusting to 45. Godspeed. Eva's gloved hand pushed the throttles forward to their stops. The engines screamed in protest, then complied, shoving her deep into her seat as the Warthog surged down the runway. The acceleration was brutal, not graceful like a fighter jet's, but relentless, like a freight train determined to defy gravity. She fought the crosswind with rudder, her feet dancing on the pedals, keeping the ugly bird centered on the white line. At 140 knots, she pulled back on the stick. The nose lifted, but the wings, burdened and broad, seemed reluctant to leave the ground. For a heart-stopping moment, she was a passenger. Then, the air caught, and the rumbling of the wheels on asphalt was replaced by the smoother, more violent shudder of air tearing over the control surfaces. She was airborne. Instead of climbing to a safe altitude, she did the opposite. As soon as the gear was up and locked, she pushed the nose down, leveling off at a mere 100 feet above the desert floor. The ground proximity warning system immediately began to blare a frantic, computerized, "Pull up, pull up." She silenced it with a flick of a switch. She had no intention of pulling up. Her survival depended on staying low, on becoming a part of the landscape. The desert floor rushed by in a blur of sand and scrub brush, the A-10's shadow a fleeting, cross-shaped specter chasing alongside her. The sandstorm hit her head-on. The world outside the canopy dissolved into a maelstrom of brown. Visibility dropped to 0. This was where most pilots would turn back, trusting their instruments to guide them to safety. Eva trusted her gut. She was flying by feel now, her hands making constant adjustments to the stick and throttle, sensing the shifts in air pressure, the buffeting of the wind, as if the aircraft were an extension of her own body. She was not flying through the storm. She was dancing with it. On her navigation display, a green line pointed the way to the Serpent's Maw. The entrance was a narrow slit in a massive rock escarpment, invisible to the naked eye until you were almost on top of it. Relying solely on her terrain-following radar and a deep, instinctual knowledge of the topography, she guided the A-10 toward the canyon. The turbulence was horrific. The plane bucked and yawed, groaning under the strain. Every rivet seemed to be screaming. In the TOC, they would be seeing nothing but static and a wildly fluctuating altitude reading. They would assume she was already dead. Suddenly, the turbulence lessened. The brown chaos outside was replaced by a sheer wall of red rock flashing past her right wingtip. She was in the entrance to the Serpent's Maw. The canyon was even narrower than the satellite images suggested. The rock walls shot straight up, hundreds of feet on either side, their surfaces scarred and ancient. The sky above was a thin, angry ribbon of swirling dust. Down here, on the canyon floor, the wind was funneled into a chaotic vortex, but she was below the worst of it. The GPS signal flickered and died, cut off by the stone. She was on her own. Her knuckles were white on the control stick. Her focus narrowed until the entire world consisted of the view through her canopy, the green glow of the HUD, and the feedback from the machine she was strapped into. The canyon floor was not flat. It was a treacherous river of sand and rock, forcing her to constantly adjust her altitude, climbing over boulders and dipping into dry washes. She threaded the A-10 through a series of tight, winding turns, the wingtips clearing the canyon walls by what felt like inches. This wasn't flying. It was navigating a three-dimensional maze at 400 miles per hour. A single miscalculation, a moment of hesitation, and Hog 7-1 would become a crater. Up ahead, the canyon straightened out. Her target was less than a mile away. She could see muzzle flashes now, tiny sparks of light high up on the canyon walls. Enemy positions firing down on Hunter 3. The radio crackled to life, the signal bouncing weakly off the rock. It was the PIN team's leader. "Is anyone on this net? We are taking heavy fire. We're being bracketed. I don't think we're going to make it." Eva keyed her mic, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the storm of chaos. "Hunter 3, this is Hog 7-1. I am in the canyon. Talk to me. Where is the heaviest volume of fire coming from?" There was a moment of stunned silence, then a choked, incredulous voice. "Hog 7-1, you're in the canyon? Holy shit. They're in the cave's northern wall about 200 feet up. A heavy machine gun. It's got us pinned." "I see it," Eva said, her eyes already locked on the source of the flashes. A dark recess in the rock, spitting fire. It was a difficult shot, requiring her to pull the nose up at the last second, fire, and then dive to avoid stalling. A textbook maneuver, but in this claustrophobic space it was nearly impossible. She armed the GU-8 Avenger, the 30mm cannon, the heart of the Warthog. Her thumb rested on the trigger. "Hunter 3, stand by for gun run. Danger close." She didn't wait for a response. She eased the stick back, the nose of the A-10 rising to meet the target. The HUD's targeting reticle settled over the cave mouth. For a single, frozen second, the aircraft hung in the air, on the very edge of an aerodynamic stall. Her thumb depressed the trigger. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical event. The entire airframe was seized by a violent, bone-jarring shudder as the 7-barreled cannon unleashed its fury. BRRRT. A 2-second burst. In that time, over 130 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each the size of a beer bottle, left the muzzle at 3 times the speed of sound. A stream of white-hot, depleted uranium slammed into the cliff face. The rock around the cave didn't just chip, it vaporized. The machine gun nest and the men manning it ceased to exist in a flash of pulverized stone and brilliant orange light. The sound of the cannon, a monstrous roar that dwarfed thunder, echoed and re-echoed down the canyon, a proclamation of judgment delivered from the sky. Eva immediately pushed the stick forward, diving to regain airspeed, the stall warning horn screaming a brief, frantic protest before falling silent. In the TOC, a junior analyst stared at his screen, his mouth agape. The drone, still circling high above the storm, had caught a glimpse of the event through a momentary break in the clouds. 1 second, there was a machine gun emplacement. The next, there was a smoking black hole in the side of the canyon. Colonel Thorne stood motionless, his eyes locked on the screen. He had just witnessed a pilot perform a miracle wrapped in an impossibility. On the ground, the men of Hunter 3 stared up in disbelief as the A-10 roared over their heads, its engines a triumphant thunder. The oppressive weight of the machine gun fire was gone, replaced by a ringing silence. Their radio crackled again. It was the pilot. Her voice was as calm as if she were ordering coffee. "Hunter 3, target neutralized. What's next?" The tide had just turned. The momentary elation was shattered as new threats emerged. The enemy was smart, adaptive. Realizing a conventional anti-aircraft system was useless against a target flying inside the canyon, they changed tactics. Figures appeared on the canyon rims, silhouetted against the stormy sky. They carried RPGs. It was a simple, brutal solution. Turn the canyon into a shooting gallery with Eva as the sole target. Hog 7-1. This is Hunter lead. The voice from the ground was urgent. They're on the ridges above you. Both sides. You're a fish in a barrel. Eva saw them. The HUD's thermal imaging highlighted their hot forms against the cooler rock. A puff of smoke erupted from the northern rim, the backblast of an RPG launch. A heartbeat later, a rocket-propelled grenade streaked down toward her, trailing a tail of fire. She broke hard right, the G-forces crushing her into her seat, the A-10 groaning in protest. The RPG zipped past her canopy, missing by a dozen feet, and slammed into the opposite canyon wall in a bloom of fire and shrapnel. Another launch, this time from the south rim. Then two more. The air was suddenly thick with deadly, unguided projectiles. In the TOC, the grim reality of her situation became terrifyingly clear on the drone feed. The blips representing the RPG teams were multiplying along the canyon's edge. She was trapped between a firing squad in a stone corridor. Colonel Thorne grabbed a microphone, his voice tight with command authority. Hog 7-1, this is Archangel. Disengage immediately. Get out of that canyon now. That is an order. For a moment, he used his official command call sign. But then, as if realizing the futility of ordering a pilot in her situation, his voice softened, becoming more personal. Wraith, abort the mission. We'll find another way. He had used her old call sign, Wraith, a name that carried the weight of past ghosts, of missions that had gone off the books and into legend. It was a name he had forbidden anyone to use, a name he associated with reckless insubordination. Now, in a moment of desperation, he was using it as a plea. Eva's reply was instantaneous, her breathing even, her words clipped and precise as she threw the A-10 into another violent, evasive maneuver. Negative, Archangel. I'm not leaving them behind. A profound silence descended upon the TOC. The junior officers and NCOs exchanged nervous glances. She had just directly disobeyed a command from the theater commander. But Thorne didn't explode. He didn't threaten a court-martial. He watched the screen, where the tiny icon of Hog 7-1 was jinking and weaving in a dance of impossible survival. He saw the RPGs missing, some by feet, some by inches. He was witnessing a level of raw, instinctual piloting that no simulator could teach, no regulation could contain. His rigid, by-the-book world was cracking at the seams. After a long, tense moment, he keyed the mic again. His voice now stripped of all authority, leaving only a grudging, fearful respect. Understood, Wraith. Godspeed, he had ceded control. The mission and her life were now entirely in her hands. Eva knew she couldn't simply dodge forever. Her luck and her fuel were finite. She needed to clear the rims. But the canyon was too narrow for a standard strafing run. She couldn't climb without exposing herself to the gauntlet system, and she couldn't turn sharply enough to engage targets almost directly above her. She had to break the rules of physics. Hunter 3, she transmitted, her voice strained by the G-forces. Keep their heads down. She rolled the A-10 hard to the left, diving toward the canyon floor to build up airspeed. The rock wall rushed up to meet her. Just when a collision seemed inevitable, she pulled back hard on the stick, simultaneously kicking the right rudder. The maneuver was violent, unnatural. The A-10, a plane never designed for agility, responded with a shuddering complaint. It entered a steep, climbing bank, its left wingtip carving a hair's breadth from the stone face of the canyon. She wasn't just turning. She was using the vertical wall as a pivot point, a high G-turn that took her from the bottom of the canyon to the top in seconds. The RPG teams on the southern rim, who had been looking down at her, suddenly found themselves staring straight at the nose of a warthog as it screamed up the rock face toward them. They were stunned, frozen for a fatal second by the sheer audacity of the move. It was all the time Eva needed. Still holding the aircraft in a near 90-degree bank, flying on its side, She selected a pod of Hydra rockets. She didn't fire them all at once. She squeezed the trigger in short, controlled bursts, walking the explosions up the ridge line. The rockets streaked from their pods, impacting the rim in a series of concussive blasts. Rock, dust, and bodies were thrown into the air. The threat from the southern rim was gone. But she was bleeding airspeed fast. The stall horn began to shriek, a constant, terrifying alarm. She was hanging in the air, 1,000 feet up the canyon wall, on the verge of falling out of the sky. She slammed the stick forward and to the left, rolling the plane inverted as the nose dropped. For a dizzying moment, she was flying upside down, the canyon floor now above her head. She completed the roll, leveling out just feet above the sand, the engines screaming as they fought to keep her aloft. She had cleared one side, but the teams on the northern rim were already taking aim. She didn't have the energy for another climb like that one. She had to use her most famous and most feared asset. As she raced down the canyon, she rolled the aircraft slightly, giving her a clear line of sight to the northern rim. It was a snapshot, a fleeting firing window of less than 3 seconds. She didn't use rockets this time. Her thumb found the cannon's trigger again. BRRRRT. Another burst, this one longer, angrier. She didn't aim at a single point. She swept the cannon's fire along the entire length of the ridgeline, a scythe of depleted uranium that chewed through rock and flesh with equal indifference. The enemy positions vanished in a storm of their own making. The top of the canyon was scoured clean. Silence returned, broken only by the howl of her engines and the whistle of the wind over her canopy. She had done it. She had flown into a kill box and killed it first. With the immediate threats on the canyon rim neutralized, a precious window of opportunity had been created. Eva's breathing was heavy in her oxygen mask, her flight suit soaked with sweat, but her voice on the radio was pure steel. Hunter 3, this is Wraith. LZ is clear. I say again, the LZ is clear. Pop smoke on your position. Extraction bird is inbound. ETA 5 minutes. A plume of purple smoke billowed up from behind the rock formation, a vibrant splash of color against the monochrome red rock and brown sand. It was the signal. High above, a Pave Hawk helicopter that had been holding in a safe orbit began its descent, racing toward the Serpent's Maw. Eva's job wasn't over. She was now the shepherd. She banked the A-10 into a tight, circular pattern, her cockpit a command center from which she watched over the entire operation. One eye was on the ground, watching for any new enemy movement, the other was on her threat display. And that was when she saw it. A new, terrifying symbol blinked to life on her screen, the SA-15 gauntlet. The enemy, realizing their ground forces had been decimated, was reorienting the system's powerful radar, trying to get a lock on her through the canyon's mouth. They were attempting to thread the needle, to catch her as she circled. A high-pitched, insistent tone filled her headset. Missile lock. The gauntlet had found her. Wraith, you're painted. Thorne's voice crackled from the TOC, filled with a new, raw fear. Egress now. Get out of there. She ignored the order. The Pave Hawk was still on its final approach. If she left, the enemy might have a Manpad's team she'd missed, ready to take a shot at the slow-moving helicopter. She would not allow it. Negative, Archangel. I'm holding until Hunter is secure. She deployed a cloud of chaff, a storm of tiny aluminum strips that momentarily confused the enemy radar. The lock tone broke, but she knew it would be back in seconds. She needed to do more than just distract the gauntlet. She needed to blind it. She had one Maverick missile left on its pylon. An air-to-ground missile designed for destroying tanks and bunkers, not a sophisticated radar system miles away on a plateau. But the missile's TV guidance system gave her an idea. She flew directly toward the canyon's eastern exit, pointing her nose straight at the source of the radar emissions. The missile lock tone screamed again, more insistent this time. On her multifunction display, the Maverick's camera feed came online, a grainy black and white view of the world ahead. She slewed the camera's view upwards, past the canyon walls, toward the plateau. There it was, a rotating radar dish, the source of her imminent death. It was a tiny target miles away. An impossible shot. "Fox 2, she muttered, squeezing the trigger. The Maverick dropped from its pylon, its rocket motor igniting with a brilliant flash. The missile streaked out of the canyon, climbing toward the sky. Eva didn't wait to see if it hit. She broke hard left, diving back into the relative safety of the canyon, pulling GS that made her vision tunnel. The lock tone from the gauntlet wavered, then died completely. On the display in the TOC, the icon for the SA-15 search radar flickered once, then vanished. "Target destroyed," a stunned analyst reported, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, she took out the radar dish. With a Maverick. From inside the canyon." Thorne just stared, speechless. Down below, the Pavehawk touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash. The 3 soldiers of Hunter 3 scrambled aboard, hauled in by the crew chief. Less than 30 seconds after landing, the helicopter was airborne again, climbing out of the canyon, safe. "Talon 1 has the package," the Pavehawk pilot reported. "We are clear. Thank you, Wraith. We owe you 1 inch. Glad you're safe, Talon," Eva replied, her fuel gauge now blinking a critical red. "Hog 7-1 is Winchester and RTB, out of ammo and returning to base." She pointed the nose of her battered Warthog toward the eastern exit and pushed the throttles forward, climbing out of the serpent's maw and into the full fury of the sandstorm, a lone ghost disappearing back into the maelstrom that had delivered her. The landing was a controlled crash. The sandstorm had reduced visibility at Kandahar to less than a quarter mile. The crosswind was a malevolent, shoving hand. Eva flew the final approach entirely on instruments, her hands and feet making 1,000 tiny corrections, her mind a cold, clear calculator of wind speed, altitude, and glide slope. She saw the runway lights only seconds before the wheels touched down. The A-10 slammed onto the asphalt with a jarring impact, crabbed sideways against the wind. She fought the rudder, keeping the beast straight as it decelerated, the tires screaming in protest. She taxied toward her designated hardstand, the canopy still caked with a fine layer of red dust from the canyon. The storm howled around her, whipping sand into stinging clouds. Through the maelstrom, she saw 2 figures waiting for her. Staff Sergeant Vance was one. The other was Colonel Thorne. She ran through the shutdown sequence, the engines spooling down with a final, mournful sigh. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the wind. She unstrapped, her muscles aching, her body humming with the lingering vibration of the airframe and the adrenaline of combat. When she pushed the canopy open, the gritty wind hit her face. Vance was already there, climbing his ladder to meet hers. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, knowing respect. He reached out and placed a hand on the fuselage near the cockpit, a quiet communion with the machine that had brought his pilot home. The gesture said everything. Eva climbed down, her legs unsteady. She pulled off her helmet, and her dark hair, plastered to her head with sweat, fell free. She stood on the tarmac, the wind whipping at her flight suit, and faced the colonel. Thorne's face was unreadable, carved from the same granite as before, but his eyes were different. The dismissive arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like awe. He took in the state of her aircraft, the dust, the scorch marks around the cannon's muzzle, a few new dings on the titanium bathtub that encircled the cockpit from small arms fire she hadn't even noticed. He looked at her, a lone figure against the raging storm, small and yet radiating an unshakable strength. He walked forward until he was standing directly in front of her. The wind tore at his words, but she heard them clearly. "The debrief can wait," he said, his voice rough. He paused, as if searching for the right protocol, the right words, and finding them inadequate. He settled for simplicity. "Your official flight status has been reviewed. The grounding order is rescinded." He met her gaze directly. "Your call sign is hereby officially reinstated, Captain Rostova. Welcome back, Wraith." Then he did something that stunned every crew member who witnessed it. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man known for his rigid adherence to protocol and his emotional distance, raised his hand to his brow and rendered a slow, sharp, perfect salute. It was not the salute of a superior officer to a subordinate. It was the salute of one warrior to another. Eva stood straighter, her fatigue momentarily forgotten, and returned it with equal precision. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The action had spoken for itself, a deafening roar louder than any cannon. Inside the TOC, miles away from the howling wind of the flight line, a young airman at a secure terminal typed a series of commands. He navigated to a personnel file. Rostova, Eva, Captain. He found the line item marked Status and deleted the red-flagged entry. Grounded, pending administrative review. In its place, he typed 2 words in crisp, green letters: active flight duty. He hesitated for a moment, then moved his cursor to the field labeled call sign. He deleted the system-generated placeholder and typed a single, 5-letter word: Wraith. He hit save. The file was updated. The legend was restored to the official record. The storm raged through the night, a cleansing fury that scoured the airfield. Long after Thorne had left and Vance had begun his post-flight inspection, Eva stood alone beside her aircraft. The wind was a physical force, trying to push her back, but she stood her ground. She ran a bare, gloved hand over the scarred nose of the A-10, the paint rough and gritty under her fingertips. The metal was still warm, ticking softly as it cooled. Felt alive. She reached into a pocket on her flight suit and pulled out the small, worn photograph of her father. She unfolded it carefully, shielding it from the wind with her body. She looked at the man with her eyes, the pilot who had flown on the edge of innovation and paid the ultimate price. For years, his legacy had been a shadow she couldn't outrun, a reputation for recklessness she had to fight against, a standard of brilliance she felt compelled to meet. He had died pushing an aircraft past its limits, a spectacular failure that had been memorialized as a cautionary tale. Tonight, she had done the same. She had pushed her aircraft, and herself, past every conceivable limit. But she had not failed. She had not become a ghost. She had become the Wraith. She had taken his legacy of impossible flying and forged it into a tool of salvation. Looking at the photo, she felt a quiet shift inside her. The weight of his memory was no longer a burden, but an anchor. She carefully folded the picture and tucked it away. The final image was one of profound solitude and earned peace. The massive, ugly A-10 sat silent in the driving sand, its engines cooling, its cannons empty. Beside it stood its pilot, a solitary figure whose quiet competence had bent the will of commanders and rewritten the rules of aerial combat. The howl of the wind was the only applause she needed. Her dignity was intact, her purpose reaffirmed. With one last look at the machine that was a part of her soul, Captain Eva Wraith Rostova turned and walked away from the flight line, a silhouette disappearing into the heart of the storm she had just conquered.